Ulysses S. Grant married Julia Dent, and Julia Dent was gifted a enslaved Black woman who was later referred to as Black Julia or simply Jule, and she became the Black woman behind Julia Grant. Welcome back to another episode of Fashion Meets History with Domii Davis. We remember Ulysses S. Grant because he was the Northern general that freed the slaves. But did you know that he and his wife were slaveholders? Before you get your stomach all in a bunch, Ulysses S. Grant's family were abolitionists. His connection to the abolitionist cause and being the eventual leader of the army that helped to free the slaves was accurate. It just happened that he married a wealthy Southern woman who did have a family that was slaveholders. However, that doesn't take away the fact that just because Grant was a staunch abolitionist and came from abolitionist roots, that his wife held those same beliefs. Julia Grant married Ulysses S. Grant and wanted to maintain the lifestyle she had been accustomed to her whole life, which was a pretty soft life. And it must have been love because homeboy was not popping the way her father and her family were popping. Like any good father, and I'm a daddy's girl myself, her father bequeathed several of the enslaved persons of the Dent estate to his daughter. The slaves were the possession of his wife via his father-in-law. Although she was married to a prominent Union general, the Union general, during the Civil War, Julia Dent was very upset when her lifelong companion and seamstress, Black Julia, decided to exert her free will and run away while she was following her husband on the warpath. So, what's the story? As a child, Julia Dent was gifted a enslaved companion from her father, who came to be known as Julia, or Black Julia, or simply Jules. We can infer that her name was Julia because her mistress was Julia, and she was a child, and children often like to name things after themselves, but it's unclear. From that young age, Julia Dent came to regard Black Julia as her right hand. Julia was not only her companion, she was like a lady's maid, a maidservant, which means that she was responsible for dressing and styling Julia Grant. After Julia married Ulysses Grant, Black Julia helped with the raising and the caretaking of the children, like most other enslaved house servants of the period. But what's unique about the relationship between Julia Grant and Black Julia is that Julia Grant had extremely poor eyesight. And that means that because of their special bond and relationship, and there are historical references that say that Black Julia was happy as you can be, being an enslaved person, being in service and servitude to Julia Grant. And so they did have a positive relationship, as much as it can be positive. But because of this bond and this relationship, Julia Grant highly depended on Black Julia, especially as she continued to grow older, because Julia Grant was losing her eyesight. And that means that Black Julia was not only just responsible for the regular day-to-day maintenance of Julia Grant, she was responsible for making Julia Grant appear as Julia Grant in the way that Julia Grant would want to appear. Taking it a step further and really anticipating and knowing your client and knowing exactly what they want before they know it themselves. With that information, we can assume that Black Julia was highly perceptive and intelligent, because they maintained a positive relationship, which means that she was likely very good at her job. And like most other charming Southern belles, Julia Grant liked what she wore. She was into what she wore. She was into fashion, like the other first ladies that we've referenced in the series. Black Julia had to be hyper aware of what was popular, what was trending, what was stylish, what fit Julia Grant, what style went with her body type, all of the kind of attributes that we would put on a stylist in 2026. Black Julia was doing for Julia Grant, and at a extremely high level, because Julia Grant's sight was impaired. Now, their relationship continued up until the Civil War, where in about 1864, Black Julia decided she did not want to return to Missouri, which understandable, and she wanted to run away and claim her freedom. In the words of Julia Grant, she asserts that Black Julia would have had her freedom regardless, not only because of the Emancipation Proclamation that happened years earlier, but because of their bond and their kinship. Not to mention that her husband, Ulysses S. Grant, had already freed one of the enslaved people that her father sent to them to help them along. It is a fair assertion that if Black Julia would have stayed, she probably would have gotten her freedom, but Black Julia didn't want to take that chance, and let's be real, I don't blame her. We do know from Julia Grant and historical records that Black Julia, after she escaped, was married shortly thereafter, and for all intents and purposes, probably had a decent rest of her life. It was after the Civil War, or the Civil War was about to end, Reconstruction was looming, and depending on where she was in America and who she married and the success of who she married, and if she used her skill set, she potentially could have had a very good life, especially because Julia Grant taught Black Julia how to read. This intensified the skill set of Black Julia, especially after she escapes and goes out into the world. The number of previously enslaved Black people who were able to read and write and fend for themselves in that way was very, very limited. That skill, in addition to her highly intuitive skills with styling and likely her work in sewing, could have set her up for a prominent life like that of Elizabeth Keckley. Black Julia's departure from enslaved life hurt Julia Dent, mostly because, from Julia Dent's perspective, because of their bond. She even goes on to say, "I regretted this. She was a favorite of mine," and that while Jule more than likely would have received her freedom through the Grants, that she guesses Black Julia was ready to start her new life away from the Grants, which valid. But nevertheless, this loss was felt greatly by Mrs. Grant, who about 4 or 5 years later was thrust into the office of First Lady without her favored stylist / seamstress. What was a First Lady to do? No worries, Julia Grant remained an extremely fashionable First Lady. History suggests that she relied on seamstresses in the area and the hired staff at the White House to get things done. An extreme taste and style, and the elaborate gowns with handmade lace and layers of pearls and diamonds. It could have been a tad bit more if she had her beloved Black Jule as her hands and eyes for those events. Although history does not refer to Black Julia as a seamstress, we can infer that she in fact was. Like many enslaved house servants of the time period, sewing was probably a skill set that she was taught and or inherited from her family, like her mother, or her grandmother. Also, Julia Grant herself sewed. During wartime, Julia Grant served the war effort by helping to sew the uniforms of soldiers. We can also infer that Black Julia helped with this kind of important work, showcasing her skills in this area, and not just the styling capabilities that she presented to help maintain Julia Grant as a public and political figure. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of Fashion Meets History with Domii Davis. Stay tuned for more. Bye.